since the start of COVID-19. Are ICU units are prioritizing people who are white, wealthy, and healthy over those who are most marginalized. In this way, systemic and institutional racism is also very much a generational thing. The laws which our racial ancestors put into place and which affected Black, Indigenous, people of color in their time now get passed down so that we reap those benefits, and they disproportionately affect Black, Indigenous, people of color of our time.
Except most of those laws have been outlawed, but yeah, fine.
So if you don't believe me, let's have a look at some examples. Citizenship and exclusion laws in the 1800s made it impossible for Black, Indigenous, and people of color to have the same jobs as white people, or to even be allowed to save money. Meanwhile, white people in the 1800s had already accrued a large amount of wealth off of Black, Indigenous, and immigrant workers.
I'm pretty sure we fixed that law.
And even the poorest of white people, such as Irish and Italian immigrants, who at the time were not viewed as white, were allowed to subjugate workers based on a racial hierarchy. Irish and Italian workers were actually some of the first militia allowed to capture enslaved individuals, kind of like the first police force.
Yeah, you finally got a thing right.
So the next time you say, oh, the Irish were slaves, the Italian were slaves, no, they were servants, and they were allowed far superior rights. Anyways,
this is also right. But there was a white slave trade. So white people have been slaves.
Started a racial wealth gap, something which still has not closed to this day in many countries around the world, including the US and Canada. White people are not only earning vastly more money, but they're being born into far more generational wealth as opposed to families of color.
I swear to Jefferson Davis, you cannot be serious. You want to know why Black people don't make as much money? It's because in most countries the better of a job you do, the more money you make. Hence is why Asians make the most money. It's not a racism thing. Do your research. Also, if you didn't have to pay Black people as much, then businesses would only or mostly hire Black people. And one way to fix this is to become communist.
Who had to start from scratch much later in life. To break this down a little bit further, it's estimated that here in Canada, women of color earn 59 cents for every dollar earned by white men. Men of color earn 79 cents for every dollar earned by white men. And this is despite the fact that people of color overall have a much higher participation in the employment field.
But do they work as hard? If they don't work as hard, then they don't make as much money. And participation is nothing unless you work hard. You can't be lazy and expect to get more money. Sorry, that's just how it works. Also if you do participate but barely do anything but still get money, the people who worked harder get more money. Why would you give everyone equal amounts of money no matter if they worked harder or were lazy? Tell me this. I can't live in a world with unanswered questions.
In the US, women of color earn as little as 54 cents per dollar earned by white men. Asian women earn as much as 90 cents, but these figures are often skewed, not taking into consideration the different backgrounds of Asians.
I looked it up. All of them say Asians make more. Why would all of these be lying?
Such as South Asian, Southeast Asian, East Asian.
Asians are Asians.
Men of color make as little as 87 cents per dollar earned by white men, with, again, Asians earning more, but the figures are not quite representative of the whole.
And not all Black people make less money because it does not represent all of them.
Compounding this wage gap is the fact that banking institutions and employment hiring practices are very racially biased. Banks notoriously discriminate when it comes to their mortgage and lending practices and are approximately 2.7 times more likely to turn away people who are Black and Indigenous, or give much higher interest rates. Black, Indigenous, and people of color are up to 108% more likely to have a high interest, high cost loan. When businesses are looking for employees, even in what is considered a low discrimination country, whatever that is, I honestly don't know what that looks like anymore. Employers are still 25% more likely to hire a white person. Employers are also far more likely to give a job interview or a callback to somebody with a white-sounding name, such as John Smith.
That is the most redneck name. And also what if you have an ethnic first name but white-sounding last and middle name? What then?
Education laws also have something to do with this. Initially, post-slavery, Black students were not allowed to go to school at all. Here in Canada, our Indigenous people were also segregated. When they were not allowed to go to the same schools as white people, and their schools were comparably underfunded. Schools were eventually integrated, but the high school and college graduate rate for families of color was significantly lower due to being held back for so long. The graduate rate has increased over the years, but it's still comparably lower overall, with 42% Black college graduation rate in the US and 30% in Canada.
Okay.
Again, this is how racism becomes a generational thing. Post-slavery, Black, Indigenous, and people of color were not allowed to own their own property due to citizenship laws. When they finally could, a system known as redlining was put into place, which barred them from owning certain property. This is still a system that is in place today. Redlining forces communities of color into the poorest neighborhoods and subsequently lowers the property value. Schools in the US get their funding based off of property tax, meaning the education people get is not universal. Once they started seeing that these neighborhoods were filled with predominantly lower income people of color, companies started building their repositories nearby, polluting the air and leading to more health complications. Redline neighborhoods are actually several degrees hotter than non-redlined neighborhoods. But while pollution rose in these areas, the amount of grocery stores lowered, leading to poorer diets for those who, for various reasons, couldn't travel farther to get their goods. This is known as environmental racism. Healthcare used to be...
There is racism for everything now. Soon there will be galactic racism. If you refuse to take in black man to space, you're racist. Also, the government is starting to turn most of these into better places.
Entirely segregated, so you guessed it, there were white-only hospitals where the care was top-notch, and Black people and Indigenous people had to build their own hospitals where supplies were often low and funds were low. It was normal for Indigenous populations across North America to receive segregated healthcare and very poor healthcare. Here in Canada, Indigenous populations were forced into the basements of hospitals where white people were afraid they had something called native tuberculosis. While clinics have become desegregated today, medical racism is still a pervasive issue in our society.
Everything imaginable is racist now.
For example, doctors still believe that Black people feel less pain and that their skin is thicker, and they are less likely to prescribe pain medication to a Black person even when it is medically necessary. Indigenous people are more likely to be accused of intoxication where there is none present, and there is an epidemic of both parties being ignored to death. Voting was done entirely by white men for a very long time. Slowly, men of other races were allowed to vote, and then women. And it wasn't up until roughly the 70s or 80s that everyone had the right to vote in North America. But then came voter suppression. Laws which made it harder for marginalized communities to vote based on who had citizenship, who had proper identification, and who had been to jail or prison. Who did these laws target? Of course, Black, Indigenous, and people of color.
Times changed. No more of those bullshit laws.
Mass incarceration is an enormous system that started decades ago, starting with the war on drugs in the Reagan administration. This was a fake war to target Black communities who were no more likely, in fact, far less likely, to sell or possess drugs. The rates of incarceration only went up from there as mandatory minimums were put in place, as well as stop and frisk or stop and search laws. These are laws which would give police the right to stop anyone they deemed looked suspicious without any evidence or warrant. This meant that more and more Black, Indigenous, and people of color were being stopped on the streets for no reason other than a racist cop, and charged and put in jail at increasingly higher rates than white people. It's estimated that 1 in 3 Black men will face an arrest charge at some point in their life in the US.
Black people tend to commit way more crimes, but whatever you say.
With Black people overall 6 times more likely to be imprisoned than white people after having committed the same crime or no crime. Afterwards, having their rights stripped of them upon release, because once you go to jail, gaining employment becomes even that much harder. You have to check the box that says you are a felon. Renting or owning property becomes that much harder than before because you have to check the box which says you are a felon. And voting becomes out of the question, and chances are that there was a low or no offense. It's even possible to have these rights taken away without ever having gone to jail, only being put on probation or parole.
White people also get their vote rights taken away for those reasons too.
Meaning there are millions of people, millions, predominantly Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the US unable to vote. This is honestly just a simplified version of some of the systemic racism that has been passed down generationally. Now keep in mind, for each of these, it was white people who enforced these systems, okay? It was us. And it's also white people, us, who continue to do so.
Wait for what the future holds, my friend.
We have not historically nor presently experienced race-based discrimination in property, employment, banking, environment, healthcare, voting, policing, or justice systems.
How many times do I have to say this? Nazi Germany.
And if you think I'm wrong, I'd encourage you to start this video from the top. I'm sure that I am missing a lot here. I'm going to be linking a few books down below which have helped me a lot in my education.
You are missing a lot more than what you think.
And some articles as well if you're unable to get the books for whatever reason. I know that some people either don't have the money, and libraries right now are also kind of at capacity in terms of loans. So I will leave those down below if you'd like to continue your reading. I'll have details for where else you can find me around the internet, and there's a subscribe button down below if you would like to follow me here. Please feel free to do so, and if you don't want to, that's okay. I hope you learned something here, and if not, I tried. Thank you so much for being here. As always, Black Lives Matter. All lives can't matter until Black Lives Matter.
Cringe.
See you soon. Bye.
I guess that's it. I'll be read some of the comments later. Okay, goodbye.